Well, good afternoon. My name is Matt Terry, and welcome back to May's Research Forum. I find it hard to believe that it's actually already May. This will be the second to the last one in our series this spring, and I think we should maybe wait another 2 minutes just to make sure that everybody's arrived. Our guests have arrived, so that's good. We're under control in that respect. So we'll be back in just a minute or two. All right. I think we can begin. Waiting always drives me a bit crazy. So again, welcome. My name is Matt Terry. I'm a research librarian here, and I have the good fortune to helping coordinate the various fellowship programs that we have, that are, of course, supported by all my colleagues, many of whom are here today. And I must say that this is one of the parts of the fellowship program that I and my colleagues look forward to the most, especially over the last year when having casual conversations has been very difficult. Getting a good sense of what you've been doing in the research room and how it impacts the work that you're doing is really quite difficult. So this gives us a chance to sort of regroup. The format is pretty standard at this point. We'll have two speakers. They'll each go for about 20 minutes. If you could hold your questions and put them in either the chat box, or of course you can unmute yourselves and ask at the Q&A session that'll be at the end. Both people will speak for roughly 20 minutes, which leaves us something on the order of 15 to 20 minutes to sort of have a discussion with them. Let me introduce everybody that's here today. Well, not everybody, the speakers that are here today. Our first speaker is going to be Conrad Jacober. And Conrad received a pre-dissertation prospectus fellowship that was funded by the Hugh McColl Fund for Business and Banking, which was really perfectly sort of shoehorned in this respect. He is a PhD candidate in sociology at Johns Hopkins, where he researches the history of financialization. His talk today is going to be called The Southern Route to Interstate Banking, NationsBank, and the End of the New Deal Financial Order. Our second speaker today is going to be Derrick White. He received a visiting research fellowship that was funded by the Parker Dooley Fund for Southern History. Derrick's a professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. His talk today is going to be The Escape of Matthew Bullock and the American Lynching on Trial. So with no further ado, we're going to go to Conrad.
Okay, I'm going to do a little quick troubleshoot for sharing this. I'm seeing a couple different PowerPoint options, but I think this is the one I want. Okay. So the question is, are you all seeing my PowerPoint or the presenter view with the notes? Matthew, I think you answered, but you're muted.
We're seeing your PowerPoint. I think this is what you had done earlier. So I think
okay, perfect. Okay. All right. So just make sure I have a cup of water. So my presentation is titled The Southern Route to Interstate Banking, NationsBank, and the End of the New Deal Financial Order. And thank you all for coming. I'm really excited to present some of my research to you all. This was my first big archival visit since the pandemic, and so it was really exciting for me. I had planned a bunch of archival visits for the summer of 2020, and then the pandemic hit, and so this is the first time I really got to dig into the archives, and I found some really interesting stuff, and I hope to share some of that with you all today. So what's pictured here is North Carolina National Bank's headquarters in Tampa, Florida, planned and built from 1982 to 1988. North Carolina National Bank would later become NationsBank in 1991 before acquiring and taking the name of Bank of America in 1998 and moving its headquarters to Charlotte, North Carolina, where it remains to this day. This presentation tells the story about how a relatively small regional bank from North Carolina became one of the biggest banks in the world. It also gives the story for why Charlotte, North Carolina remains, I believe, the second biggest financial center in the United States to this day. It will also, I hope, tell something about the past and present and future of financialization, which is what I study in my dissertation, which I can explain a little bit later. So for context, this is the chapter of my dissertation, which is titled Debt Profits, American Bankers, and the Origins of Financialization, which explores the question of what led to the transformation of finance in the post-war era. And in approaching this question, my dissertation is situated between, institutionalist sociologists who study things like the Federal Reserve, federal policymakers, and trying to understand like the transformation of finance, and Marxist scholarship, which studies the macroeconomic order and trying to understand the move of capital from industry into finance. And so where I see my project fitting is trying to understand the role of banks in this transformation, which has been relatively understudied, interestingly enough, because financialization you would think would be mostly about banks. But one of the problems with studying banks, and why I suspect that banks have not been studied much in trying to understand this transformation of post-war finance, is because bank archives are exceedingly difficult to access, almost impossible. Banks have infamously been sued in the past based on findings from their corporate archives. And so the reality is, most historians sort of, move away from studying banks, especially in the post-war era, because many of them are still active today. That said, there are some archives like the one I studied in at UNC Chapel Hill's Wilson Library, of bankers who consider themselves in some ways public intellectuals, and so they were really leaders, of business groups, of banking groups, of trade associations. They wrote for Wall Street Journal. They saw themselves as shaping in some ways the post-war economic order, and they cared about their legacy, and so they donated their papers. And so despite the problem of not being able to study a lot of banks, you can actually get some pretty good archival sources on bankers and some of the things they were involved in. And I think the NationsBank records at the Wilson Library is a prime example of how we can study, or of a place we can study the transformation of post-war American banking. All right, so I'll just give a brief overview of some of the questions that are pushing my dissertation along, which is what role do banks play in the development of financialization, and to what degree is their role in concert or conflict with that of state actors and other interest groups? So the story about financialization that's been told thus far is that the Federal Reserve was facing a lot of crises in the 1970s, largely of inflation, which we're experiencing again. And some of the ways that the Federal Reserve tries to make its way around this crisis is by relaxing its rules on banks. Banks were running into a lot of crises, problems with their loans because of rising interest rates. And so the Fed sort of relaxes its stance on banking regulations. And federal policymakers do similarly with deregulations of depository institutions in 1979, and several other acts of financial deregulation like Garn-St. Germain in 1984, and what I'll talk about here, Regal-Neal in 1994. And so that focus, it makes sense given the archival collections on the Federal Reserve and on federal policymakers. But there's a huge hole in a lot of this, which is, what are banks doing? In some ways, the way this has been constructed is that The Fed opens the floodgates and banks just fire right through it, these sort of automatic actors that have little to no agency themselves. And so I want to ask, what are bankers' political and economic interventions, and what vision for a post-war economic order, or an economic order outside the New Deal do they have? I'll skip the methodology since I'll talk a little bit more about what I did in the archive. So this chapter is a case study of interstate banking deregulation, and pictured on the left here is North Carolina National Bank executives, including senior executive Hugh McColl, after whose the fellowship I received his name. He's hoisting a Florida state flag upon their successful acquisition of a Florida bank in 1982. Hugh McColl had served in the Marine Corps and was even called a Marine in banker's clothes, though in this photo he's wearing both. The pose these bankers are striking here is a clear play on the iconic photo of American Marines hoisting the American flag over Iwo Jima following the island's conquest in World War II. What conquest were these banks so eagerly celebrating? Since the 1927 McFadden Act, the 1956 Bank Holding Company Act, commercial banks and bank holding companies had been barred from banking across state lines and were further geographically regulated by each state. Some banks were prevented from opening bank branches more than 30 miles from their headquarters. Some were limited to their home county, their home city, and in some cases unable to branch whatsoever. Large commercial banks had fought against these regulatory boundaries for decades, but they would not achieve the full deregulation of intra and interstate banking restrictions until the 1994 Regal-Neal Act. But it's 1982 in this picture, 12 years prior to federal deregulation, and NCNB's just broken into Florida, routing federal banking regulations. They did so by exploiting a loophole they discovered in Florida state banking laws, creating a foothold in the state that they would use to successfully lobby for further interstate banking deregulation in Florida and throughout the South, creating a powerhouse out of a small regional bank and accelerating the demand for federal deregulation to level the playing field between banks of different states, and ultimately leading to the era we're currently living in, where there are about 5 big banks that rule finance in this country. What follows tells a different story of financial deregulation, and ultimately, I argue, a different story of financialization, which I define as a process whereby financial markets become increasingly central to capital accumulation, and finance increasingly intermediates every aspect of our lives. This story is one not focused at the national scale on federal policymakers, but at the state level on banks and state policymakers. What we see is a portrait of a movement by bankers for financial deregulation, one which bubbles up through a state-by-state strategy long before it bursts onto the national stage in 1994. Let's go back another decade to 1973. Tom Storrs, chief executive of NCNB from 1969 to 1983, is presenting at a conference on the future of banking hosted by the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. He's got some harsh words for the Fed. I'll start a bit earlier than where the quote on the slide starts. And I apologize for the long quote here, but it's interesting. Storrs says, quote, "I think that supervisors, meaning the Fed, should interest themselves in the structure of the system, for it too is an important feature of the quality of service which banks are able to render to their customers. Thus far, I am under the impression that questions of structure arise primarily in deciding the competitive aspects of proposed mergers and holding company acquisitions." Now onto the slide. "I hope that one day they will lead each federal agency to consider structure sufficiently important to lead it to take position on its own initiative with regard to federal authorization of intrastate branching by all national banks and ultimately of interstate branching by these banks. The economic facts already dictate this, but no one charged with public interest has stepped forward to sponsor such legislation. How important are the concerns which I express? Are they to be interpreted simply as the efforts of a banker to improve his lot or to increase his stockholders' earnings? I hope not, for I view our industry as undergoing a revitalization, as reaching forward to make up for the lethargy and overly conservative policies of past decades. The impetus for progress is clearly present, and the management capabilities of banks grows daily. Flexible and progressive supervisory attitudes and policies are equally essential to an increased economic contribution by banks. And I could spend a whole rest of my presentation just unpacking this quote, but I'll just say what Storrs is doing here is calling out the Fed for its conservatism in supervising banks, arguing that the progress of finance has fallen to banks themselves, that the Fed is no longer leading the progress in the financial industry. Storrs argues that banks are fighting for the public interest to better serve consumers and contribute to the country's economic growth, but that those actually tasked with upholding the public interest are fighting them at every turn. So he decries the Fed has failed to advocate for what he sees as the obvious and necessary move to interstate banking, as he says, quote, dictated by the economic facts. But what are those inexorable economic facts? Walter Wriston, chairman and CEO of Citibank from 1967 to 1984, gives us a good sense of the economic facts that bankers like Wriston and Storrs of NCNB saw as leading inexorably towards the reality of full interstate banking. Drawing on an extended analogy to Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, Wriston draws us to what he sees as the absurdity of the increasingly uneven and patchwork regulatory system of the New Deal's financial order. In a 1980 speech to the American Bankers Association, he states that, quote, it is an article of political faith in Wonderland that American banks do not compete across state lines. However, upon opening a magazine with a decidedly geographic title, we find a colorful ad proclaiming, we love New York so much, we have over 1,100 people here, and describing the catalog of banking services provided out of mid-Manhattan and Wall Street offices by a regiment of bankers from all places, a well-known California bank, which, as we all know, is barred from competing with New York banks. It is well known by every right-thinking American in this age of deregulation that all banks are regulated by the Federal Reserve Board, the controller of the currency, the FDIC, and by state banking commissions, or by some combination of them all, except has detected that there exist in these United States of America any number of financial institutions with a remarkable resemblance to banks that are, fortunately, from the consumer's point of view, not regulated by any of these agencies that so zealously oversee our banking services. It seems as though every non-bank in our society is flying into the banking business with us, but without our policemen. They are invisible only to those in official positions. Lewis Carroll explains that Alice thought the whole thing very absurd, but they all looked so grave that she did not dare laugh. She simply bowed, looking as solemn as she could. It gets, as Alice said, curiouser and curiouser. So what Walter Wriston's getting at here is that banking competition was becoming much fiercer through the 1970s. It was starting to create cracks in the New Deal financial order. Between rising inflation and Regulation Q limits on interest rates that banks could offer on deposits, savers were increasingly desperate to move their money where interest rates could offset inflationary losses. Savings and loan institutions began offering negotiable orders of withdrawal, or NOW accounts, and investment banks and insurance companies like Allstate, depicted on the left above, created mutual funds, both of which offered higher interest rates on deposits and had checking account-like functions without the same regulatory limits that bound a commercial bank's checking accounts. Even companies like Sears were in the game of non-bank banking, robbing interest-free deposits from commercial banks and doing so across state lines. To this point, commercial banks had taken advantage of the legal entity of a one-bank holding company to expand their businesses through so-called non-bank banks. Banks created through their holding companies, finance companies, trust services, loan offices, and even ATMs, which could provide a handful of financial services, but not full-service banking. This allowed banks like the California bank that Wriston mentions to get around branching restrictions and expand into other states like New York. Of course, Wriston was also in the game, the same game as big California banks. Citibank was easily the most aggressive of any commercial bank at finding loopholes and exploiting them to expand nationwide, punching many of the same holes in the New Deal financial order that they had claimed needed fixing by leveling the playing field through deregulation. This was such the case that Citibank became the boogeyman of interstate banking, the Trojan horse ready to infiltrate and level your beloved hometown banks under the guise of deregulation and competitive fairness. We see this depicted in great fashion in this political cartoon from a 1982 edition of the Southern Banker, the traded journal for the Southern Bankers Association. Notice that Citibank ATMs take the place of Achaean's finest warriors, ready to open the gates of several cities to Citibank's army of funds, mostly recycled petrodollars from the Middle East. But these aggressive expansionary moves by a big New York bank worked heavily in favor of North Carolina National Bank. Stores could claim with increasingly more evidence that the big money center banks were encroaching upon their states, that the economic facts dictated that interstate banking was coming. But critically, the South could get ahead of it. For banks like NCNB, which existed in a state that already had statewide branching, the next move had long been to try to break into other states, which Storrs was open about in his 1973 speech to the Fed, which I read earlier. The question was how to do it. On the right here is an early planning document for their interstate strategy, for which I should include the box and folder number, but is not on my slide. I apologize for that. A very useful document here. What they state here is that this, rather than this language of the broad assumption of economic facts finally winning out, there's slightly less certainty than in the public speeches. The focus here is which states should they try to break into, which acquisition targets of other banks in other states should they seek, how do they gain entry to the states, and whether they should move through non-bank subsidiaries in the meantime. Notably, they, quote, didn't want to make a lot of noise about their moves. Their plans moved fast, however, and within a year, NCNB had sought to pass legislation through the North Carolina legislature to pass a reciprocal banking agreement. In his memo to the North Carolina legislature accompanying North Carolina's draft legislation, which is here on the left, in 1979, Storrs wrote, quote, "This bill provides that bank holding companies whose operations that are principally conducted in any of the southeastern states could acquire banks in North Carolina if their states of domicile provided reciprocal privileges to bank holding companies located in the states. This enabling legislation would permit the development of regional banking organizations of sufficient size to compete effectively with money center banks in acquiring funds at lower prices and in the specialization which these institutions presently offer. Effectively, the bill's reciprocity agreement stated that, quote, if you let our banks into your state, we'll let your banks into our state. This was, however, limited to bank holding companies because it depended on a loophole in the Douglas Amendment of the 1956 Bank Holding Company Act, which permitted bank holding companies to operate in other states if explicitly invited. The same loophole did not exist for the 1927 McFadden Act, which governed banks but not bank holding companies. So critically, Storrs argued that this legislation would allow for the development of a regional bank, a regional Southern bank in this case, to become large enough to compete with the money center banks in New York and California. He makes the case that Southern banks were going to be wiped out otherwise, but he failed to convince enough of the smaller banks in his state who rightfully saw that they would be swallowed up by the large and mid-sized banks from other states seeking to get a foothold in North Carolina, something Storrs recognized in private. NCNB subsequently failed to get the support of the North Carolina Bankers Association, with even Wachovia and First Union Bank seemingly uninterested, and the bill never made it out of committee. Storrs' friend, Guy Botts of Barnett Banks in Florida, also failed to get similar legislation passed in Florida. But Storrs was confident they would find success in the next 2 years. I should probably go a little faster here since I'm approaching 20 minutes, at least on my timer. But on the left here is a document that effectively invites Tom Storrs to the Southern Growth Policy Boards. This is one of the great things about actually being in the archives is that you see over and over the mention of an organization like the Southern Growth Policy Boards, which seemed pivotal in North Carolina National Bank eventually winning reciprocal banking throughout the Southeast. And you look up what is the Southern Growth Policy Boards, only to find that their archives exist in the archive that you're currently studying in. And there's a lot of really interesting stuff in it. And so what you have here was Storrs, becoming a member of the Southern Growth Policy Board, which was an internal think tank of the Southern Governors Association, And you see him actively winning the argument for Southern regional banking. This is a quote on the screen here from Irby Simpkins, a Nashville newspaper editor, presumably with little interest in banking, but a healthy heaping of Southern pride. He says that probably any proposal you make is going to be considered radical by either independent bankers or the holding company banks, but I think there needs to be some courage on the part of the commission in terms of that, because if we don't, my theory is, if we don't have some expression of interest in strong, viable banking systems within the South, then we're not going to be determining the future of the South. Someone who lives in New York is going to be determining the future of the South. And so what happens effectively is that Tom Storrs goes to the Southern Growth Policy Board, makes the case that if you don't pass regional interstate banking, we're going to be swallowed up by a bunch of New York banks in a few years when it inevitably happens. And he makes the case successfully. And the Southern Growth Policy Board officially recommends to all Southern states that they pass reciprocal interstate banking just for the South. This is exactly what happens. And NCNB becomes NationsBank, swallows Bank of America, and creates a financial center in Charlotte, as well as, Wachovia, of course, being successful here until the recent recession. Sorry for the crash landing there, but I should stop here, and yeah, looking forward to the questions section. Thank you.
Conrad. Yeah, I'm looking forward to the questions section too. That'll be interesting. Derrick, we're going to turn to Derrick White now, who is going to be talking about his forthcoming work, The Escape of Matthew Bullock, An American Lynching on Trial.
Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just do a quick kind of overview of what I'm going to do this afternoon. I'm going to open with a kind of draft prologue of this project, and then I will kind of give a broad overview of this kind of narrative history that I'm kind of excavating, thanks to the support I've received from the Wilson Library. And then I guess I'll end with a brief discussion of kind of the challenges and successes that I found in the archives at UNC. And so I hope this goes well, and I appreciate and look forward to the comments as well. Let me see. Let me start here. January 12th, 1922. A loud knock startled Matthew Bullock. When the men on the other side of the door announced that they were the police, his heart raced. Days earlier, he had passed a man on the snowy streets of Hamilton, Ontario, and saw a flint of recognition in his eyes. He shook off the creeping concern, thinking it had been a year since the race riot in North Carolina that led to his brother's lynching and ultimately his escape to Canada. He let the four officers into his small flat. After addressing him as his alias, James Jones, an officer sharply asked, "Are you Matthew Bullock?" His heart sunk. He had been found out. Flanked by four detectives, Bullock walked through the stone gates and looked at the ominous Barton Street jail, whose twisted vines of ivy had lost their annual battle against the harsh Canadian winters. Once inside, the detectives escorted Bullock down a long corridor before depositing him in an empty cell. As Bullock stared at the concrete wall, he wondered how his alias had been discovered. Was he recognized? Did the authorities intercept a letter to his parents? Did someone betray his confidence? Calculating his next move, he realized that remaining in the Canadian jail was his best chance to stay alive. Extradition to the United States and back to North Carolina almost certainly meant death. He explained to the local police, quote, "Boys, I'm going back to be strung up on the first telegraph pole they come to. They ain't never gonna give me no trial, no sir," end quote. After his questioning, Bullock returned to his Canadian cell, closed his eyes, and prayed not to return home. In 6 days, the Canadian Immigration Board would decide his fate. Jail was almost certainly better than the violent death at the hands of a white mob. Amid the quiet, dark dampness of his cell, Bullock was haunted by the thoughts of the shootout that led to his brother's bullet-ridden body. January 19th, 1922. Walter White rushed to catch the evening train to Buffalo. Amelia Anderson, president of the Buffalo chapter of the NAACP, had requested a national officer to assist in their quest to stop Bullock's extradition back to the United States. Once the train pulled into the Buffalo station, Walter White was expected to meet with Mary Burnett Talbert, a stalwart of Black activism going back to the 1909 Niagara movement that had spawned the NAACP. As the locomotive ambled in the darkness, White got comfortable in the sleeping car. He knew to get his rest because in the morning, White had a chance to do something that he had yet been able to accomplish: stop a lynching before it happened. By the time Walter White left for Buffalo, he was quickly becoming the NAACP's secret weapon in the war against lynching. With blonde hair, blue eyes, and courage of steel, the affable White developed a reputation for strolling into the feverish aftermath of a lynching and eliciting details from participants and eyewitnesses that pierced the official stories of Black men ravishing white women. Using false credentials, a disarming smile, and pale skin, he induced local whites to tell gleefully the horrifying details of racial massacres. White's quest for details was aided by the, quote, obtuseness of the lynchers, end quote, who could not help but talk about their deed to any person who manifests even the slightest interest in them. Bullock's case was different. He had escaped the orgy of violence that killed his brother and forced his family to flee North Carolina. White's travel plans began in Buffalo, but also included a trip across the border to Hamilton. In Canada, White had scheduled a meeting with the African Methodist Episcopal Church that was spearheading Bullock's defense. Amid the tragedy of the lynching in North Carolina and the high stakes legal affair about Bullock's extradition, the case also provided an opportunity to debate America's response to lynch mobs on the international stage. Fortunately for White and the NAACP, a similar debate was happening in Congress over the Dyer anti-lynching bill. January 26, 1922. After 3 years of political maneuvering in Congress and a decade of activism by the NAACP, the Dyer anti-lynching bill had passed the House of Representatives with a vote of 230 to 119 against. The result was an affirmation of the NAACP's work and general disgust many Americans had when confronted with the details of lynchings. In a press release, James Weldon Johnson, the NAACP's national secretary, described the bill as, quote, one of the most significant steps ever taken in the history of America, because Congress has finally set the stamp of disapproval on mob murder. The reign of terrorism and anarchy must end is the essay to lynchers that Congress has sent, end quote. However, Johnson's excitement was tempered as he explained that the bill still had to pass the Senate, specifically a Senate Judiciary Committee that would determine the constitutionality of the bill. Within the Judiciary Committee, a number of Southern senators were determined to kill the bill, including North Carolina's Lee S. Overman. While the senator for North Carolina was planning to undermine the anti-lynching bill, his white constituents sought support in Bullock's extradition back to North Carolina. Overman's desire to subvert the bill, making lynching a federal crime, and to assist his home state in getting racial justice seemed perfectly aligned. However, as the first senator popularly elected in North Carolina, Overman honed in on this subtle contradiction. Any assistance in Bullock's extradition would undermine his state's rights argument against the Dyer anti-lynching bill. In 1922, Bullock's escape from a brutal lynching, his legal extradition case in Canada, and the Dyer anti-lynching bill were all inextricably linked, revealing the contours of American racism and Black activism after World War I. Bullock's saga has been largely forgotten amid the litany of horrific race riots and lynchings after the First World War. The red hot summer of 1919 witnessed race riots in Washington, D.C., Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, and Omaha, Nebraska, as well as other cities across the nation. Months after Bullock's escape in 1921, Black residents in Tulsa, Oklahoma experienced an orgy of violence that destroyed one of the most economic thriving Black communities in America. The Tulsa massacre and the subsequent destruction of Black Wall Street has become a touchstone for remembering the racial violence of the 1920s. Ultimately, the widespread nature of lynching and race riots has meant Specific cases are often lost to the generalized horror of racial violence. But for a brief moment, Matthew Bullock's escape from the mob's clutches that murdered his brother and another man from a North Carolina jail caused an international incident that forced the U.S. State Department and Congress to reckon with its acceptance of extra-legal racial violence. For the NAACP, which had made lynchings a national rather than a state issue, Bullock's case was apt timing. The organization's work on getting the dire anti-lynching bill through the House of Representatives points to the NAACP's organizing and propaganda capabilities. Bullock's case provides a tailor-made example of that proved the necessity of a federal law against lynching. In response, Bullock's case activated legal and extra-legal white supremacy. North Carolina's Governor Cameron A. Morrison invoked states' rights as a means to force the State Department to use its resources to return Bullock to North Carolina, while Southern senators led by Lee S. Overman employed a variety of senatorial procedures to kill the anti-lynching bill. Behind Morrison and Overman stood the Ku Klux Klan ready to kidnap Bullock and serve him up to quote-unquote Southern justice. Bullock's flight to Canada is an incredible story of survival, activism, and a reminder of the persistence of white supremacy in Jim Crow America. It was a moment America's propensity for lynching was on trial. So I want to just kind of, that is the prologue of the way I'm imagining this book as a narrative history of trying to tell the story of the Bullock family primarily, but Matthew Bullock being obviously the central actor in his escape from Warren County, North Carolina, after a shootout took place in downtown Warrenton. And so this is my picture from literally when I was in North Carolina. Thank you guys for having me there. I took a trip up to Warrenton, and these buildings are actually the same places. And so in January of 1921, Matthew Bullock's brother, this is Matthew Bullock pictured, by the way, his brother goes into a store where this Ace Hardware store is and buys 2 apples, premium apples as it was described, 10 cents worth. He goes to a nearby barbershop, discovers that the apples one of them was rotten. He asks for a refund or an exchange. He gets into a argument with the person behind the cash register who's a teenager. They begin cussing each other out. White folks and black folks realize that there's something going on. And on this Monday afternoon, he's kind of shuttled away and sent back to his house. And so over the course of a week, there's a lot of kind of growing animosity in the white community, in particular, the family around the young man the trailers who were involved in the argument, the white people who were involved in the argument, as well as the Bullocks. And so both sides begin to organize. The trailer organizes. He has several brothers. They begin to organize a group of men who want to keep black folks in their place, especially black people in North Carolina, in Warren County. And the Bullocks, I think, which is also equally interesting, led by Matt, is also organizing among a number of young black men who are desiring to kind of assert their kind of manhood in the aftermath of World War I and protect not only Plummer Bullock, but also Matthew Bullock. This leads to this disagreement happens in the early part of the week on a Monday, and then on Saturday evening, there's a shootout in downtown Norlina. This is downtown, in which 8 people are shot. No one is killed. 5 whites and 3 African Americans are shot. In the aftermath of that shooting, a number of African American men, at least a dozen, are arrested. Including Plummer Bullock and a man by the name of Alfred Williams. And Plummer is arrested. The white mob is reconfigured. They go to the Warrenton jail, which is about 5 miles away, and they pull Plummer out of the jail along with this man, Alfred Williams, who they saw as a kind of co-conspirator of the black folks who are armed, trying to protect their community. That they lynched them on the edge of town. At the same time, they're also looking for Matthew Bullock. It's not really clear, at least in my early research, exactly where he was when Plummer was arrested at his home. I gather that they had gotten separated. But when he returns home, Plummer Bullock has already been taken to jail and his father, who owned about 400 and some odd acres in Warren County, tells him to get in the family car and go see family members in upstate New York and just flee because he knew that there was trouble kind of brewing. Bullock will go back to where he had spent some time as a youth in Batavia, New York. He has a brother eventually in Rochester, and he eventually makes his way into Canada. He sneaks in. This is one of the reasons he's arrested, is that he's basically an illegal immigrant. He did not have the $250 required to enter Canada at the time, but he had lived quietly in Hamilton, and for over a year had joined a local AME church, and had basically, under the alias of James Jones, had kind of crafted a kind of new life where he was kind of a citizen. His family, on the other hand, was forced to flee. They relocate to Washington, D.C. And so at some point in January of 1922, about a year later, some folks in North Carolina get word that the man named James Jones in Hamilton is Matthew Bullock, and they send basically a warrant to Canada to have him arrested. And this is where my prologue kind of starts in this issue. And one of the things that becomes that I'm actually most interested in is that this becomes a series of trials. There is an immigration trial to see whether or not, because he had illegally entered into the country, to whether or not he could stay, right, under these extenuating circumstances. There's at least 3 trials. And the Canadian government does something I think that's actually kind of unusual, is that they actually ask for witnesses from North Carolina. So they're saying that the affidavits that the state of North Carolina is sending to Canada about attesting to Matthew Bullock's involvement in this shootout was not enough. They actually want to question these witnesses to see the truthfulness of their testimony. The state of North Carolina sees this as a front, and they're working closely with the State Department to try to get this returned. And so ultimately, Matthew Bullock wins these cases, and points to the fact that that at least Canada views lynching as extremely obviously problematic, and that they would refuse not to send one back, a young man back to be potentially harmed. And so this is to me, this is a fascinating kind of narrative history. I'm moving this more as a discussion. It is not nearly a case. It is not a case as I think as significant even as the Tulsa massacre in 1921, or even the race riot in Chicago. But it really gives us an important window because of the unique timing that the dire anti-lynching bill has been passed. There's an arrest. Governor Cameron had just taken office in January of 2021. Governor Cameron Morrison, cut his teeth as a red shirt in the Wilmington race riot in 1898. And so part of his legacy, part of him winning the governorship was tied to his ability to uphold white supremacy. And so there's a lot of kind of, I think, important issues that emerge. Let me finish up here before we get to questions about what are the things I saw in the archives themselves. I actually found that the archives, I'll start with my disappointments. Matt, we talked about this. My most disappointed is that Lee Overman's papers are at the Wilson Library, and they are very well, I mean, you get a sense of all the kind of correspondence that he has. But unfortunately, 1920, they only goes up to 1921, and there's a gap in the correspondence between 1922 and 1924. And there was nothing that kind of materialized in the 1921 correspondence to kind of give me a glimpse of what I was able to find. But on the other hand, I found that the Branson papers, who was the first head of rural kind of sociology at the University of North Carolina, was actually extremely helpful in helping me understand the Traylor family in particular. Who were these white men in this mob that ultimately lynched Plumber Bullock, but also, what was their motivation? This is not a case with a traditional lynching where you see, for instance, the case of rape, the charge of rape is not being thrown around in this case, but rather the issue is really an economic issue in which Branson's paper does a really good job of demonstrating how in Warren County, despite that Black folks had lost the right to vote, that the growth of Jim Crow, that Warren County was one of the handful of counties in North Carolina where Black folks were able to gain a foothold in land ownership. In fact, in 1920, African Americans owned more land. There were more raw numbers, not in terms of acres, African Americans who own land, and that tenant farming was actually on the rise among whites. And so there's this kind of economic tension at the core of what's happening inside of Warren County. And the Bullock family, I think, exemplifies this, as they were born in Warren County. They had migrated to New York for at least 6 years, where they were able to gain their father, Reverend William Bullock, was able to gain some financial flexibility. They buy about 400 plus acres in Warren County, and there they are represented. So they had a car. They represented in many ways the kind of threat that many of these kind of working class, what one scholar calls middling whites in Warren County are fearing at this particular time. And so the Branson papers were really, and the Odom papers were really kind of instructive. And lastly, I'll point out that what I also was able to really see is how Governor Morrison, in some of the kind of published stuff, was really campaigning at PR, running a kind of PR campaign about how North Carolina was at the forefront of lynchings. There's a document in the archives that's like No More Lynchings from 1924, where North Carolina and Morrison's administration really kind of brags about how they didn't have any lynchings in the course of his term as governor, except for this first one. And he was like, I didn't know anything about it. And I think it's a very subtle way in which they are trying to position themselves in terms of the way North Carolina positions itself in terms of progress vis-a-vis kind of its other southern states like Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama at this particular time. And so that leaves us with a few minutes. I'm going to give us 10 minutes or so to answer questions. So I want to thank you guys for your time. Let me stop share and open up.
Thank you, Derrick. So I guess we do have about 12 or 15 minutes for questions. So let's see what's in the chat. Does anybody have any specific questions? Don?
I was clapping.
My emoji literacy is not what it should be, I think, at this point.
I can no longer find the raise hand button, but I do have a question for Derrick.
Okay.
So you mentioned that there actually was a trial in Canada, which is really interesting because that means that the possibility of there's trial documentation around a case of lynching, which sounds pretty rare. And so what I'm curious is, like, do you have access to documents from this trial? Does this exist somewhere? Have you been able to find any of that and like what it shows?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, actually, so one of the things, because it's an extradition case, it generated kind of federal level documentation. And so in the Canadian archives, there's a file. The folks at the Canadian Library were very nice to send it to me, to scan it and send to me several years ago. So I've had that. At the National Archives, they have the American side of those documents as well. And then I went down to Raleigh to the governor's papers at the state archives, and you have Cameron Morrison's side of that. And that's where I was able to kind of glean some information about Morrison, particularly asking Overman for assistance, and Fernholm Simmons, who's the other senator from North Carolina at the time, asking their assistance in trying to extradite this. Because once he gets to Canada, the governor is really kind of playing, they have really less influence in this in many ways, because this is a State Department problem. And so he now needs to rely on his senators. And so one of the things I like about this story is that it allows me to see kind of all three levels of the ways in which like kind of white supremacy can work, right? So it's got the very local level in Warren County, you get the state level, but you also get the national level. And it really puts this kind of Republican government in this odd space where they're now like, do they really want to be I think it's the Harding administration, my early American history. I'm on summer vacation. Y'all just have to forgive me. The Republican administration is now like, are they going to try to really fight very hard for the extradition? And so there's a lot of interesting kind of dynamics in which once Canada asked for the witnesses and the affidavits to be in person, North Carolina sees this as a personal affront, and they were actually refused to send them. And so I think there's a really kind of interest. That's one of the reasons that he wins the case, is the case is just dismissed because they made a legal request that was not actually met by the state of North Carolina.
So much of this sounds like the current debate about asylum seeking. I assume that that's not real. I mean, that doesn't seem to be a part and parcel of the legal framework that he would have been operating in, right? This is all pre.
Well, so one of the things that happens, there's a case from 1852 or 3, the Anderson case, in which enslaved Africans had moved into Canada, and that owners had sued to have them deported back, and this Canada refused. And so there's a kind of like what Canada's kind of leaning on is actually this kind of abolitionist precedent that they had established in the 1850s ahead of the Civil War. And so this is kind of, so when we see kind of after the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act, folks who had fled to the north, African Americans who had fled to the north, began to flee to Canada because they knew that that was safe ground. And so there are a number of kind of lawsuits trying to get the Canadian government to create a functionally Fugitive Slave Act. And so that's actually what they're relying on in terms of the precedent to say, look, we could let him stay. He had been a good citizen. He had paid, he had been working this whole time. He had, character witnesses that said that he was, not in any trouble, church going person. And so there's a kind of PR campaign that his family and the NAACP, not only a legal campaign, but a PR campaign as well. And so the Canadian papers, eat this up and telling their side of the story, the Bullock side of the story of what happened.
Thank you. Conrad, I was thinking a little bit about what you had said earlier in your conversation about the relative rarity of Banks' papers. And, and I was thinking about the sort of bravery of framing a dissertation around something that we know is archivally difficult. I was wondering, what did your advisors sort of say to you about the source material that might be available, and what other Banks papers have you had access to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have the problem and also luck of being a historian, but in a sociology department. And so first they were like, couldn't this just be a statistical project? And I was like, no, like I really need to get into the archives. There's a story here that hasn't been told. But then they're sociologists. They're not like well-versed in like the state of the archives and banking. And so I didn't get much pushback at all. And they're like, sure, if you find it, go for it. But yeah, I mean, it's like, I've cobbled together just a bunch of like small, sources scattered about, like so Walter Wriston, who I mentioned this talk, has a very curated archive at Tufts University Special Collections, which I've been to, but it's so heavily curated that like there's not much there. However, his biographer, Philip Zweig, just donated a whole new accession 2 years ago and has a ton of oral history done with Walter Wriston, with other bankers, or in a circle. And that book, Philip Zweig's book on Walter Wriston, that biography is almost like a Bible for my dissertation. It's just, it's so incredibly rich. You can learn so much about like the transformation in banking of the post-war era just from that biography. And so I'm really excited to get into, his collection that he used to write that. But they're also like, Barnett Banks, interestingly, I mentioned, was eaten by NationsBank, was the biggest bank in Florida previously. a bunch of their head officers got together. This was like a hostile acquisition. They were really upset about it. They wanted their bank to be remembered. They saw themselves doing a service to consumers in the state of Florida, and they saw Florida as losing its banking industry, which it did. It was taken over by North Carolina banks, basically. And so, they wanted to be remembered. And so they donated, all their executives got together and donated a bunch of their papers to the Florida State Archives, which I just discovered recently. And so I'm going to be in Tallahassee probably in August this summer. And so I'm hopefully, it looks like a very rich collection. Another guy is, this Minnesota banker, Gabriel Hauge, who's the head of manufacturers Hanover, which is now part of Chase Bank. He was considered himself a public intellectual. He's part of the Eisenhower administration for a bit, donated his papers to the Minnesota Historical Society in the 1980s, I believe. And so that collection is like almost impossible to even find on the Minnesota Historical Society's website. And so I spent a lot of time on Archive Grid, which I believe you, Matt, actually told me about. And so I've like just dug up these small collections scattered about, which give you really interesting windows into, what's like this massive transformation that's going on this 50-year period, which just, has mostly been studied statistically, has not been studied through like the actual narratives produced around the changes, trying to understand like what bankers' goals were and, in their political and economic interventions. And so I'm hoping to piece together a story here. And I'm lucky that I'm in a sociology department that doesn't really, that gives me a little extra freedom in doing the work of a historian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we just have a minute or two. Are there any questions from anybody else? No. Oh, yes. Megan Ong is asking a question for Derrick. Did Matthew Bullock remain in Canada?
It's a great question. It's hard to say. He kind of disappears from the kind of historical record. And there's a couple things I think at play. One is that I was pretty fortunate that the Canadian census happens on the first year of the new decade, so in 2131. But Canada has also they have not made their census available after 1931, and so you have to request a very personal request, and so it makes it a little more difficult, at least at this point. There's a report that he goes to London after, because the Klan is actually they send a letter to the State Department that they're willing to kidnap Matt Bullock and bring him back to North Carolina. So he kind of goes in hiding. His family is pretty well known, and they're pretty well located in Washington, D.C. area. And but he's not, at least in by a name. And so one of the challenges is that he used an alias, and I only was able to find him in the Canadian census because the alias comes up in the newspaper accounts after he gets arrested. It's not clear if he's continuing to use that alias or if he's going by Matt Bullock. All that is very circumspect. And so that's kind of one of the big mysteries that I'm trying to track down and try to locate at this point. But that's a question I would love to know the answer to myself.
Well, we're at time. I'd like to thank you all for spending your lunch with us. We're going to regroup, I guess, in about another month on June 8th. And Huntley Hughes, one of our past fellows, is going to be talking about alternative modernities, unions, cooperatives, and the social gospel in the American South. And Eric Bontempo is going to talk about the devotional Wordsworth, repurposing Wordsworth in Victorian devotional poetry anthologies. So it'll be another conversation. And then we're taking a break for the summer, and we're going to regroup in September. Thank you all for coming. I find that pollen makes talking hard. So take care, and we'll see you soon. And Conrad and Derrick, that was so great. Thank you so much.
No, thank you all for organizing this. This is great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's